Have your Bibles, if you would, 2 Corinthians chapter number 6, if you would, please. We're taking a look at a thought, in other words, here inside this chapter 6 of 2 Corinthians. Verse 4 says, "But in all things approving ourselves as the ministers of God in much patience, afflictions." I want to focus on that word, in necessities and distresses. Focus on that thought also. "In stripes, imprisonments, tumults, labors, watchings, and fastings, by pureness, by knowledge, by long-suffering, and by kindness, by the Holy Ghost, by love and fame." Now, we've already dealt with, in other words, a couple of thoughts. We dealt with, in other words, the idea about when Paul and Silas, in other words, were beaten and thrown in jail. What I want to deal with, in other words, now is in 2 Corinthians in chapter number 11. There's where it is that he talks about the idea about going through quite a few persecutions. He makes the statements in verse 26. He says, "In journeyings often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils of..." let's go to "Thrice I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned." He said, "Thrice I suffered," in other words, the idea about shipwreck. So I want to go there right quick. Now, if you take a look at all the things the Apostle Paul went through, immediately you do realize this guy has been through some rough, tough situations. I don't know of anybody that's ever gone through, in other words, things along these lines, but I guarantee you there's a tremendous amount of persecutions, in other words, going on in the world today. As a matter of fact, a thought just hit me. Take a look, if you will. It says over 90,000 Christians were killed for their faith in 2016. That's 90,000. Now, in case, in other words, we want to do the math right quick, that's one person every 6 minutes in 2016. So when we talk about, in other words, going through a rough, tough time in our own lives, how many here knows the idea we don't have a clue of what in the world, in other words, is going on, I guarantee you, in the rest of the world. Once again, 90,000 Christians were killed for their faith in 2016. That's one every 6 minutes. How many here know that's a pretty rough situation? If you know that, say amen. Now, what I want to do is I want to go a little bit further with this whole thing and show you why, in other words, things come about in a verse like this. Why in the world would God have Christians go through such things, in other words, along those lines? Somewhere along the line, there's got to be a point. There's got to be a purpose. There's got to be, in other words, an idea of, in other words, why this thing happens like it does. Now, let me show you what I'm saying here. Whenever we take a look at, in other words, one of the shipwrecks that the Apostle Paul went through, I want you to take a look at a thought right quick that I think is interesting. Whenever the Bible talks about him getting on that ship, and all of a sudden there's where it is they're going through the storms and what have you. They made the statement that says that they were exceedingly tossed with a tempest. The next day they lightened the ship. The third day we were cast out with our own hands, the tackling of the ship. I mean, throwing out tackling is something that is kind of needed, I believe. He says, "And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, no small tempest lay upon us. All hope that we should be saved was taken away." One of the things that I think is interesting here is we're thinking that since we're Christians, then we ought to be, in other words, the individuals where nothing ever happens. Whenever, in other words, we're in cars, when we're in boats, we're in planes, or anything else on that line. Because we're Christians, right? See, that's the American thought about the idea that, in other words, we ought to be free from troubles simply because it is, in other words, we're Christians. But this is, in other words, not what the Bible teaches. He said, in other words, and he says, "And neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, no small tempest lay upon us. All hope that we should be saved was then," what does it say? "Taken away." Now, listen to me very carefully. And I think this is important. You realize all hope was simply taken away from every single person there was on that ship. It looked like it was hopeless, right? So somewhere along the line, these people are going to need some hope, right? Yeah. They're going to need, in other words, some encouragement, the idea that this thing can turn out right somehow, some way or another. But notice, if you will, in verse 21 says, "But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, 'Sirs, you should have hearkened.'" I love this. See? He said, "See, I told you so." See, if just people would ever just listen to the pastor, would ever listen to preachers, Everyone listen to Christians and what have you. Some people wouldn't be in the world of hurt that is that they find themselves in today. There's no getting around that. He said, in other words, you should have hearkened unto me and have not loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. He says, and now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. Immediately what he does is he begins to start to tell them how this thing is going to unfold. And I appreciate, in other words, that thought. He said, for there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, fear not, Paul, for thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. This is how this thing goes. This is how this thing begins to start to unfold. This is the reason why they're going through what they're going through. Notice, if you will, fear not, Paul, for thou must be brought before Caesar. And by the way, when God's not through with you, you realize you're invincible. Let me say it again. When God's not through with you, guess what you are? You're invincible. I guarantee you there ain't nothing, my friend, nothing going to happen if God's not through with you. Do you hear me? So now I got to go back to the idea when you realize, in other words, this thing's pretty well over with. You've done your course. You've done what you're supposed to be doing, whatever like that. This thing may come to, but you realize the Lord is telling him the idea. In other words, you need to be brought before Caesar, and you ain't nowhere near Caesar. Okay? He said, and lo, God hath given thee all of them that sail with thee. That means the idea that many times Christians are entrusted, if you will, with the lives of men, women, boys, and girls that it is, my friend, that come within their sphere of influence. Is this helping anybody? Now, I got to go back to the idea. You do realize the most safest place it is that anybody can be is the idea around Christians. Because there's where it is immediately. There's where it is that God's given, my friend, a lot of folks, in other words, to Christians for them to be able to minister to work with, do with, and deal with. But does anybody remember why it is, in other words, people are alive? There's two reasons. Does anybody know one of the reasons of why they're alive right now? Yes? Okay. What's the point? What's the purpose, though, of that, of God's grace? Okay, that's the idea. There's only two reasons, in other words, for you to be alive. This may make you mad, but you get however you want to get. You need to get right. The idea, there's only two reasons why you're alive today. It's either you're not right with God, you need to get right with God. Or the idea you are right with God, you need to do what God wants you to do. That God hath given thee all them. He said, wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, for it shall be even as it was told me. Howbeit we must be cast upon a certain island. But when the 14th night was come, there are 14 nights, man, in this storm. That's 2 weeks. It says, and we were driven up and down in Adria, and about midnight the ship deemed that they drew near some country, and sounded and found it 20 fathoms, and they had gone a little further. They had sounded again and found it 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest they should have fallen upon some rocks, they cast out 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day. This is a lot of nautical terms here, if you will. It says, and the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship when they had let down the boat. It says, under the color as though they would have cast out the anchors of the foreship. And Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, except these abide in the ship, they cannot be, what does it say? Saved. See, this is where some people don't realize it. How many of you you've heard me say, stay in the house?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You heard me say, stay in the house? Mm-hmm. How about somebody need to stay in the ship?
Yeah.
That good old gospel ship. Stay in the ship. Otherwise, in other words, guess what? Look at the last 3 words. They ain't going to be saved. See, somewhere along the line, it's amazing to me how that people think forsaking the house of God's going to help. This has really always bothered me. Forsaking the house of God. How in the world is that ever going to help? How is things going to get better? In other words, when that's the idea, that we believe that the house of God is not where it is we need to abide or stay or anything else on that line. That's why I've heard people say there's too many hypocrites in the church. I just assume sit, in other words, in a church full of hypocrites, I would sit in hell with them. Because this is where the truth is being preached at. Somebody ought to say amen. And the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. And while the day was coming on, Paul besought them and said, take me, saying that this is the 14th day that you have tarried and continued fasting. These people have been fasting for 2 weeks. Do you realize the idea when the Apostle Paul talked about the idea about fastings, the idea of hungering and thirstings, back over that in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, you do realize this gets a little rough, it gets a little tough. He said, have taken nothing, wherefore I pray you, take some meat, for this is for your health, and there shall not a hair fall from the head of any of you. And when he had thus spoken, he took bread, gave thanks to God in the presence of them all, and when he had broken it, he began to eat. See, this is where, listen to me now, because anybody seeing anything right here? They're in a world of hurt, right? They're in the middle of a storm and have been for 2 weeks. The Apostle Paul says, you know what we need to do is, we need to get some of the provisions that we have, let's sit down and let's eat. Isn't that what it says? Yeah. And then what does he do? In other words, whatever it is, in other words, he's in the middle of this thing of the idea about sharing that food and what have you. He sits down and gives thanks, in other words, if you will, in the presence of God, in the presence of them all. And when they had broken bread, it says he began to eat. And then he goes on and says, and then were they of all good cheer, and they also took some meat. Can you realize the idea that, in other words, the Apostle Paul has decided what he's going to do? He's going to honor God, even in the middle of a storm, if you will. In other words, and sit out and bless the food. I mean, you know, sometimes you get in such a hurry, in other words, you've taken 3 bites of food. It's halfway down, you gullet it. And all of a sudden you realize, ooh, I didn't pray. You know what the Apostle Paul's doing here is? He's giving honor to God, if you will, and the idea of even in being in a world of hurt, he's going to thank the Lord, in other words, for what it is he does have. Sometimes I think that's where it is we make a mistake at. We're so busy, in other words, complaining to God of what we don't have, we don't thank the Lord for what it is we do have. And by the way, I want to tell you something right now. If you don't think the people that are on your little ship ain't listening to you, ain't watching you, apparently, in other words, you're not paying attention. You don't have a clue of how this thing goes, or why it is. It says, and we were all in the ship, 260 souls. I mean, that's a lot of folks, isn't it? See, and by the way, just in case you're wondering that whenever you go through a rough, tough time, if you don't think a whole lot of people aren't going to be looking on, watching, listening, hearing, and everything else on that line, you're sadly mistaken there. That's not the way, in other words, necessarily has to be. But apparently, in other words, this is where it is that God's decided. He's got the opportunity to talk to 276 souls, right? Well, what better place for the Lord, in other words, to be able to influence 270 some odd, in other words, individuals, than to do it in the middle of a storm with, in other words, a Christian right in the middle of this whole situation. Anybody getting this thing? He makes the statement a little bit further. It says, and when they had eaten enough, they had lightened the ship and cast out the wheat by the end of the sea. And when it was day, and they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore, and minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. And when they had taken up anchors, they committed themselves to the sea, loosed the rudder bands, and hoisted up the mainsail. Man, that's a lot of Navy stuff there, isn't it? Is that falling into a place where 2 seas they ran the ship aground, and the 4 parts stuck fast, remained unmovable. The hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves, and the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that they could swim, should cast themselves first into the sea to get to land, and the rest on some boards and on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe, what does it say? To land. But it's not through. And when they were escaped, it says, when they knew that the island was called Melita, it says, the barbarous people showed us no little kindness, for they kindled a fire, received us every one because of the present rain and because of the cold. They're miserable, folks. The Apostle Paul talked about the idea about being in cold, fastings, in nakedness. Now, I don't mean, in other words, I don't think he was running around with the words, how many knows you can have enough clothes, but it ain't the right kind of clothes. It's the idea that they're a little thin. He said, and when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid on them the fire, there came a viper out of the heat and fastened on his hand. Okay, let's stop right there. Okay, are you kidding me? You mean to tell me that, in other words, after going through 14 days of a storm in the middle of a shipwreck and what have you on that line, he turns around and seemingly, in other words, gets some kind of a break in the middle of this whole thing. The first thing happens is he's sitting there, in other words, gathering some sticks, in other words, to be able to build a fire, and what jumps out? A snake bites him. Yeah. Are you kidding me? Is anybody getting this? Why in the world, in other words, would the Lord, in other words, do something? Why would he allow something along this line? Anybody hazard a guess?
For another miracle.
That's right. Time, that's right. Time, in other words, to move from one situation to the next. He's already, in other words, had a tremendous influence, hasn't he, already on 276 individuals, right? Come on. I'm just trying to show you here. Okay, now let's move on to the next thing. Okay, they're shipwrecked. They're on an island. There's a bunch of barbarous, in other words, individuals. We have no idea. Thankfully, in other words, it is that they're pretty hospitable. They turn around, in other words, and trying to warm them. And all of a sudden, here's where it is. The Apostle Paul, in other words, gets bitten by a snake. Saw the venomous beast, in other words, hang on his hand. They said among themselves, no doubt this man is a murderer, whom though he hath escaped the sea, yet vengeance suffer not to live. See, immediately what you got to realize is how people think. When people all of a sudden see Christians go through a rough time, a tough time, and what have you on that line, you do realize immediately when something bad happens to a Christian, their first thought is what? That's right. There's got to be something wrong. But what most people don't realize and don't understand the idea, sometimes, in other words, it's not the idea about something being wrong. It's the idea about, in other words, somebody, my friend, being right, and then turning around, if you will, in other words, and getting this thing headed in the right direction. Because here's where it is. He's trying to have an influence on, wanting to have an influence on these individuals. And sometimes what God does is He fixes a situation so it is, in other words, that you can shine, if you will. And the idea about, in other words, him getting bit by a snake, and it says, and he shook off the beast into the fire and felt no harm. Oh my goodness gracious alive. I find this so interesting. It says, but howbeit they looked when he should have swollen or fallen down dead suddenly, but after they had looked a great while and saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds and said that he's what? Oh my goodness. It's just drastic. It's one or the other. Either this guy's godless or he's a god. Yeah. Why can't we strike and find ourselves some kind of a balance someplace in the lives of these individuals? Come on, somebody say amen here. And that's the idea. But see, somewhere along the line, people have got to see Christians how they really, truly are. This is what's going to affect, in other words, these people, in other words, for righteousness' sake. And then it goes on, it says, in the same quarters were possessions of the chief man of the island, whose name was Publius, and who received us and lodged us 3 days courteously. And it came to pass that the father of this individual lay sick of a fever, of a bloody flux, and to whom Paul entered in, prayed, and laid his hands upon him, and was it saved? And healed him. And so when this was done, others also which had diseases of the island came and were healed, and also honored us with many honors. And when we were departed, they laden us with all the things that they were needed. You see what we're talking about here? It's the idea, my friend, God is trying to use Christians to go through rough, tough times so people can immediately, my friend, see how to be able to handle things, in other words, like this. And this is the idea, in other words, of what we're talking about here, start to finish. we've got to realize, understand, and let me give you an example, in other words, of what it is we're talking about. Let me show you the opposite side of this whole thing. I was thinking about, in other words, this morning, about, in other words, showing, again, I guess, in other words, the opposite side of this whole thing. And what I got to thinking about was, in other words, one of the times whenever it is the idea that the Lord Jesus and his disciples, in other words, were in a similar situation to some degree. The Bible says, in other words, in the book of Mark chapter 4, it says, and on the same day when the even was come, he saith unto them, let us pass over to the other side. And when they had sent away the multitude, they took him even as he was in the ship. And there were also with him other little ships. Now listen to me now very carefully. They're in one ship. What's around them? All little ships, in other words, around them. And the reason is the men, they're wanting to stick, and they're wanting to stay, in other words, close, in other words, to the Lord and the disciples and what have you, more than likely, because of the miracles and stuff and whatever on that line. And there arose a great storm of wind, and the waves beat into the ship so that it was now full. And he was in the hinder part of the ship asleep on a pillow, and they awake him and saith unto him, Master, carest not that we perish. And it says, and he arose and rebuked the wind and said, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said unto them, Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? And they feared exceedingly to one to another, What manner of man is this, even that the wind and the seas obey him? Now the problem with this whole thing, can you imagine, in other words, what it is that happened here? The Bible says in verse 38, he is in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on a pillow, and they awake him and saith unto him, Master, carest thou not that we perish? Now, here's what we got to grab a hold of. Those little ships all around, in other words, the Lord, and in other words, those disciples. So, what is the message from the disciples? Is that the message?
From the Lord it is.
What's the message from the disciples?
We have no faith. We have no faith.
But what is the audible message that those little ships heard?
Don't you care about it?
Yeah, you don't care a thing in the world about it. We're fixing to perish. Don't you care anything about us? See, this is the idea. And matter of fact, I'll be honest with you. I'm really thinking, I got this thought a couple of weeks ago about the idea of charging God foolishly.
Yeah.
You wouldn't believe, in other words, how many Christians charge God foolishly. And I don't think, in other words, we're getting it, folks. I don't think we're getting it. And the older you get, especially some of you that are getting older.
What?
Well, especially those of you that are getting older. What? I don't think, in other words, we're getting it there either. See, you do realize that immediately this thing is going on, in other words, into another chapter. It's going from chapter 27, going to chapter 28. And whenever you're getting older and what have you, you realize you're turning pages in the chapter. This thing ain't going to be just exactly the way it was, in other words, start to finish. So I got to go back to the idea, so what are you going to do?
Continue.
Yeah, but if you're not careful, watch the little ships around you. Be careful you're not charging God foolishly. Because sometimes, in other words, when all of a sudden health begins, by the way, when health fails, sometimes, in other words, it's not about you. Sometimes it's not about you. Sometimes when health fails, like with Job and what have you, you do realize it didn't have a thing in the world to do with him. It was him that the word health failed, but it wasn't about him. It was about everybody else. See, this is where it is. I don't think people get this whole thing. Sometimes, in other words, the idea, how are people going to treat you when all of a sudden, here's where it is that you end up getting cancer, you end up getting heart problems, you end up getting, in other words, just health problems, period, what have you. How are people going to treat you? What are you going to do when something bad happens, in other words, like a snake bites you? It's all of a sudden, in other words, now he's a murderer. There's something bad wrong. This guy's got sin in his life, otherwise a snake wouldn't have bit him. Is that right? But then all of a sudden he don't fall down and die, doesn't swell up and fall down and die. Now he's a God.
Right.
Come on. Come on. Somewhere along the line, man, we've got to grab a hold of this situation. And then I've heard people, in other words, give you this, well, I tell you what, I wouldn't put up with this, I wouldn't put up with that, I wouldn't. And I thought to tell some Christians, well, fine, tell the Lord that. Tell him how bad you are. But apparently, in other words, somebody is going to go through this situation because God knows that they can, should, could, would, and need to, apparently. And again, it's got to go back to the idea, sometimes it ain't about you. It ain't about you. This is what, in other words, we've got to realize and we've got to understand. Yes.
Brother Daddy, I think sometimes we get so busy doing other things and then God has to stop us to make us stop and listen to him. And that's kind of hard to take when you're worried, you've got sick people, you got this and that. And then God just says, calm down and stop.
Yeah. I think a classic example of that is, remember I made the statement, the Apostle Paul, all he wanted to do is go door knocking, soul winning, outreach, and ministry. And everybody's thinking, yay. But you know what? That's all fine and dandy. He did a whole bunch of that. But there came a time whenever, in other words, you need to stop. You need to slow down. You need to stop. And you need to sit there, in other words, and you need to sit down and write 14 books of the New Testament. That's what I need you to do. And sometimes, in other words, just the idea about slowing down is exactly what was needed. Can I talk to y'all just for a minute? Just out of my heart. Now, I don't know this for a matter of fact, so don't sit there and try to act like it is. Woo! That Brother Danny's just got a handle on anything and everything. So I think seriously, Brother Haynes was a classic example of that. Brother Haynes, he almost killed himself. Matter of fact, I'm glad I said that. Let me show you what we're talking about there in the context of that right there. Yeah, right here. There's a fellow by the name of Epaphroditus. Yet I suppose it necessary to send unto you Epaphroditus, my brother and companion, and labor and fellow soldier, your messenger, that he ministered to my wants. For he longed after you all, was full of heaviness, because that you had heard that he had been. See, he had a couple of procedures, little procedures. Okay. For indeed he was sick, nigh unto death, but God had mercy on him, and not him only, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I send him therefore the more carefully, that when you see him again you may rejoice, and that you may be less sorrowful. Receive him therefore in the Lord with gladness, and hold such in reputation. For the work of Christ he was nigh, what does it say? Unto death, not regarding his life, to supply your lack of service towards me. Brother Haynes, every time I read that I think about Brother Haynes. I mean, Brother Haynes got to the point where it is, in other words, he had a heart bypass. He had, in other words, calcification, in other words, in his arteries and stuff along that line. I mean, tell you, the stroke. I'll never forget this as long as I live. He actually, in other words, fell off the stage and broke his collarbone before he started preaching. Sam Hensley was in the audience. He walked up to Sam Hensley and he says, "Here, brother," he says, "can you preach for me tonight?" He said, No. He said, no, not going to do it. He couldn't get Sam to preach for him. Did you know Brother Haynes went ahead and preached with a broken collarbone that night?
I didn't hear it.
Huh?
I didn't know that.
Oh, that's the craziest thing I ever seen in my life. Okay? But in other words, now let me show you something. I think when he was going through all these health problems and what have you, I think it was the Lord trying to tell him, you need to slow down, you need to stop, and you need to get somebody ready to take that church. Because when his health failed finally, in other words, I think it was with the stroke and what have you, that church wasn't ready for a called pastor. They were not ready. Now, early in the process, they were heading in the right direction. They were considering Brother Patrick and what have you. You guys have heard me talk about that. They were heading in the right direction. But as soon as that pretty well fell through, or Brother Patrick said he didn't feel like God was calling him there, as far as that goes, they begin to start to change, in other words, their direction and looking for a different kind of an individual. When they did that, they knew they was going to have to get Brother Hames out of the way, and they told him that they didn't want him to be on the board any longer, or on the council, or anything, in other words, like that, trying, in other words, to find the pastor. Okay? So, I was going over there every once in a while. He'd call me up and what have you. I can remember him making the statement. Listen to me very carefully. He made the statement and he said, I have no idea why it is that God didn't take me, he said, instead of taking my wife. And I found that so strange whenever it is that he said that. It actually took me aback. And I can remember the thought coming to me is the idea. I said, well, Brother Ames, I said, I'm going to be honest with you. I think the Lord knows what he's doing. And I said, and apparently, in other words, he took her, in other words, to keep you here. In other words, and now you've got something it is that you need to do. I was trying to get him, in other words, to sit down and just simply, in other words, tell all of his illustrations, all of his stories. I was actually, in other words, I was going to hit the church up back in the day to get a digital recorder, an easy one for him to be able to work with and what have you, and just simply, in other words, just talk into that thing, onto that thing. We'd put it on CDs and just different things, in other words, along that line, trying to desperately get, in other words, the wisdom that man had and what have you, down, in other words, on tape or something. He never taped himself. All those years I asked him, I said, did you ever tape yourself? He said, no. Oh my goodness. Come on. See, here's the idea that whenever, in other words, health begins to start to fail, all I'm saying is the idea, you just need to ask the Lord why. What is the point? What is the purpose? Every single bit of it has got a point, has got a purpose. Yes?
I'm going back just a little bit. Why do the church want his influence on selecting a new pastor, or his input on it?
Why, did they or didn't they?
Didn't they?
Didn't they? Well, first of all, he had a lot of people against him. There was in the church at the beginning. He fixed this thing so it is he could pretty well kind of, and that's why they were considering Brother Patrick. That was a good thing. They were heading on the right track. They had nailed it down to what it is, in other words, the individual had to believe. Okay? So all of a sudden, as soon as they got him out of the way, they knew immediately what they were going to be able to do is start looking in some other directions. For somebody that wasn't a soul winner, didn't believe in door knocking, outreach, ministry, buses, and right on down the line. Okay? Why did they? Because they didn't want the same kind of guy.
He
really
never
didn't.
got along with his board. Never.
Right, no.
No, he told me that
Many years ago. That's right. He said
like
everybody he'd ever won to the Lord, trained up and what have you, turned right around, in other words, and sat down, in other words, and ended up essentially, basically, in other words, becoming his enemy.
Yeah.
No getting around that. It's a heartache, heartbreak. No getting around that. Don't want to get it. Go ahead.
Who would be more valuable in selecting his replacement than himself?
Right. But they got to the point, honestly, they were done with him. And the way it is that he ran that church, which is the idea. I don't know about you, but you realize with him soul winning, door knocking, outreach ministry, got the buses and what have you on that line, you do realize that puts a lot of pressure on, in other words, leadership. Some leadership, in other words, don't want the pressure. So you got either, and whenever they were going to sit down, and that's exactly what they did. They didn't want to do no soul winning, no door knocking, no outreach, no ministry, and couldn't care less about them buses, couldn't care less about them and what have you. And so that puts a lot of pressure, in other words, whenever this thing is going and growing and stuff along that, and they got nothing to do with it. And that's exactly what happened to them. That's where they got, in other words, sideways with him and what have you, began to start to oppose him and so many different things, in other words, along that line. It's a shame. There's no getting around that.
He was a different man. I mean, you had to bear with him sometimes. When we first got back to the association, I scared the earth out of him. I wouldn't even talk to him because I didn't know what he was going to say or do or nothing. But as you watch him and the things he did do and the way he did it, that you became more comfortable with him and realized that he was a man of God.
And see, that's the heartache and the heartbreak of the whole thing. Just quickly, I mean, in other words, let's follow it up, might as well. When Brother Hames, in other words, retired, or not retired, but whenever it is that he retired, or whatever you want to call it, stepped down, in other words, from his position, they were running 422 in Sunday school. 422 in Sunday school. That's actually what it had gotten down to. Because his health, in other words, did immediately affect, in other words, the whole situation. Here, several years ago, I was at a service, in other words, over there. I was at the hospital with Pam's mom or dad, I'm not really sure. And I remember going to the service over there. Somebody preached for me here, and I was over in Bakersfield. And I was there about 2 years ago. I think that'd be the context of Pam's mom. Yeah, I guess it was Pam's mom or something like that. I'm not sure who was in the hospital. I went over to the service, in other words, and they had a bulletin on Wednesday night, and they were going to have a Sunday school drive. And their first Sunday school drive, their first goal was going to be, I think their first goal was going to be like 100 or 125. Well, if that's your first week's goal with a 4-week Sunday school, it's going to be like 100, 125, 150, something like that. Maybe it was 100, 150, up to 200, something along that line. So they were running less, in other words, than 100. Went from 422, in other words, less than 100. And the reason is because they decided to get somebody, in other words, that wasn't anything like Brother Hames. They got him. There he is. That's what this thing boils down to, is that right there. But I got to go back to the idea. At the same time, I really believe seriously, in other words, somewhere along the line, Brother Hames, in other words, needed to, you need to make an assessment, in other words, about your health issues. You really do. Now, if it's just the idea about, in other words, seeing how people are going to treat you, what they're going to do, how your family's going to be, and stuff and what have you on that line. See, I don't know about you, but some of your health failings that you're going to end up having, you're going to find out how your family is. You're going to find out they couldn't care less.
That's right.
They couldn't care less. In other words, if you need an operation, you need help, you need thus, you need such, you need so, you need so. But you do realize whether you want to find out about it or not, the Lord's going to make sure it is you do.
That's right.
See, sometimes the Lord wants you to know things whether you want to know them or not.
Amen.
Just saying. So that's the reason why sometimes God, in other words, does what it is that He does. Okay? I'm just trying to show you. So anything comes into your life immediately. In other words, don't react bad to it. The worst thing it is, in other words, you can do. I think Jonah is a classic example. Jonah, my goodness gracious, he said, I'm not going to go there. I don't like them people. Don't want to do anything to people. I'm going to Tarshish. Got on a ship. Got on a cruise ship. Started heading on out. Storm came up and what have you. You do realize he wasn't a good witness even to those mariners that were on that ship. They said, in other words, I'm a Hebrew. I fear the Lord. He may have been Hebrew, but he didn't fear the Lord. If he feared the Lord, he wouldn't be there. So he's also a liar too. So immediately what happened was the idea that he said, why is this storm coming up? He says, because of me, I'm backslid. So you realize those are, in other words, not good testimonies to give folks. The reason why we're in a storm is because I'm backslid. Well, how are we going to turn this thing around, what have you? Let's start throwing stuff out and what have you. Let's start selling stuff. Let's start doing this. Let's go crazy, what have you. I mean, no, that wasn't the answer. Until it is, in other words, that Jonah decided to sacrifice himself.
Yeah.
Come on. As soon as he sacrificed himself, self-sacrifice will cause people, in other words, to begin, in other words, to come to the Lord. As soon as he self-sacrificed himself and decided he's going to do what it is that God wanted him to do. Come on, talk to me now. As soon as he did that, the Bible makes a statement, those mariners and what have you begin to start to offer sacrifices unto the Lord. Read it someday. See, that's the idea. The reason why the Apostle Paul was able to have 276, in other words, people on that storm, what happened was self-sacrifice. He sacrificed, in other words, himself to stand up, if you will, in the middle of this whole thing and say, we need to do this, we need to do that, we don't need to do this, we don't need to do that. And my friend, he took over. He got on as a prisoner, ended up as the pilot of that ship. And that's exactly, in other words, what Christians need to do in your everyday life. I don't care where you're at, who you are, what you do, or anything else along that line. That's what's needed. When we go through a rough, tough time, God is the one orchestrating this thing. God's the one behind the whole thing. God is the one, my friend, trying to bring about, in other words, something, an influence of your life, in other words, in the lives of those, in other words, that are not believers. Well, if they are, they need to, in other words, come from where they're at to where they need to be. Let's pray.